Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Riprap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Pamela, and we're going to talk about her books on improvisation in the 18th century, which I found fascinating. Maybe we should define what improvisation is to start with.
Improvisation is the art of making music at the moment, but it is often misconstrued as being something that just drops from the sky, like the Rapture in reverse, and lands on somebody and misses most everyone else. But actually it's more like extemporaneous composition. It is akin to the way that Greek orators studied and prepared for their speeches, because this was, of course, before teleprompters and any kind of written aid. So what orators had to do is create this mental structure, and they actually visualized this as if they had this blueprint or architecture castle in their home, in their brains, and they would in each room place a main topic. It's kind of what we do with outlining a speech today, but in each room then there was a very vivid image, such as a blood-soaked skin or something that would grab their attention, and then they would think, okay, that blood-soaked skin is my exordium, that's my opening attention-grabbing statement, that's my hook. And then they would move to the next room, and that's the narratio, where they're giving the background of a piece, and then the propositio, where they're giving the main point of the piece, and then they would confute it in the confutatio, and then confirm it in the confirmatio, so argue against it and for it, and then conclude with the peroratio, which was a summary or a conclusion that harkened back as a bookend to the exordium. And this is how, historically, how improvisation worked as well, is that the musicians who were able to improvise didn't just do this on a whim, but they studied it, they practiced it day after day, and they had these wonderful blueprints from which they could derive a structure for their music, but decorate it in different ways. So one day the room might be some sort of leaf green or something, and then the next day it might be an ornate gold, so, but within the same structure. And then they would have a different structure they could use. And pretty soon they had multiple structures and then could improvise preludes, fantasias, fugues, and any number of forms or genres based on the structure. So that's why extemporaneous composition is really a truer, better definition of improvisation than just music made up at the moment on a whim. It's a much different type of thinking and preparation, certainly.
Well, I must confess I both performed and sung Bach, but I never realized this other dimension to what was going on. And he had quite an elaborate involvement with this improvisation.
He did, and what's so interesting, Jim, is that today we think of Bach primarily in terms of his composed music, because that's what's extant, that's what's concrete, and what is performed over and over. But that's only a very small percentage of Bach's music. During the 18th century and already in the 17th century, we do have records of audition requirements for getting a post. So a director of music at a church or castle or a court would be required to do a number of things, and often they're itemized into about 8 or 10 items. 90% of what they were required to do for an audition for a music director position was improvisation.
Oh, gosh.
So they were improvising preludes, fantasias, fugues. They might be given a subject upon which they'd have to make a fugue. They were given a thorough bass line, which is just a bass line with numbers under it. The numbers signify what harmony, what intervals are to be used above that bass. And they were expected to, on site, to be able to read that and create harmony and complementary melodies with the bass line to work collaboratively with a singer or a flute player, a violinist, oboist. And So that the only written part was the bass, and they again needed to know the principles of harmony and melody to do that. And then they were only asked often to read one piece of music. So when Bach composed, of course he wrote out the parts for cantatas, because when he was directing choirs, orchestras, with a harpsichordist and or organist with the group, they all needed to be playing the same music. And so that usually wasn't improvised. But when he composed solo works for violin, cello, gamba, harpsichord, organ, quite often the solo works were not just intended to create repertoire for posterity, because that wasn't the way the 18th century musician's mind worked. It was to teach Bach, his students, how to compose, how to improvise, really. So we have, for instance, the two-part inventions are still standard repertoire for keyboardists as they're learning how to play the piano or the harpsichord or the organ. There are many, many copies of that in the hand of Bach's pupils. And the way they learned how music worked, how to improvise music as well as how to compose music, was copying it. So they would copy the incipit of the first line, and then the two-part inventions are imitative. They're an imitative counterpoint, so that one voice will enter first, and then the other voice will enter at an interval after it, at a measure or a measure and a half or two measures. Then copy that voice and see, how does this work in imitation? How does it work vertically? How does it work horizontally? And that's how they learned. Now, it was really in the late 19th century and of course in the 20th century when we're no longer dealing with feather quills and parchment, and we all had to make our own copies of any music we wanted to preserve, but we had photocopy machines and printed music and easy access to purchasing music, that this art of improvisation started fading, because there was more and more repertoire to play, and suddenly improvisation wasn't taught as much in the schools and the conservatories, and it was preserved longer in France and the Netherlands and a few pockets in Germany than in most places. Here in the United States, improvisation was really not something that was part of a classical musician's upbringing or training. So I found the need to resuscitate that.
How did you get involved with this? How did this start up as your moment, your initiative?
Part of it was a passion. Of course, everything starts from that passion. When I was a child, I used to practice my piano repertoire and my violin and singing, and then the organ, which I started a little bit after the other instruments. I would practice my repertoire, but I wanted to keep playing or keep singing, and so what I would do is play right next to the piano. My parents had an LP stereo system, and so I would just put one of the LPs on the stereo system and listen to a track on that, and then go to the piano and see if I could figure out how that harmony and that melody was conceived. And I would just go back and forth, play that same track over until I figured it out. And then once I figured it out, I wanted to see if I could do more with it. So it was just kind of a personal challenge, and I mean, I always liked puzzles and games when I was a kid, and it was my own musical game, and I just did it for my own enjoyment. I didn't really have, no one was teaching me that, because most teachers just taught repertoire. So I did that throughout my childhood, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was, my happiest moments were just spent trying to figure out how does that work, and what else can I do with that. But when I got to music training in college, I started, practicing again, voice, piano, organ in the different practice rooms, and I would listen in the corridor and I would think, I'm not hearing anyone improvise. Everyone's just playing repertoire. I wonder if professional musicians don't improvise. And so I became a bit alarmed and thought, maybe I better stop improvising now that I'm becoming a professional musician. Maybe what I need to do is just focus on repertoire alone. So I stopped for a few years, and then my organ professor invited the famous Dutch organist Klaas Bolt from Haarlem in the Netherlands, and he played this fantastic St. Bavo Kerk organ. That's an enormous organ in a huge Gothic building with rolling acoustics, and he came and played the organ and gave a psalm festival. And he was, because in the Netherlands the tradition was to sing Genevan psalms. This was the Reformed church tradition. And he improvised on these psalms. And it was the most alive, gripping, passionate, affect-filled playing, expressive playing that I had ever heard. And at that moment I thought, no, every musician has got to learn how to improvise. And so then I went back to doing this on my own and was searching, who's teaching improvisation. At that point, again, in the States, it was very rare to find anyone who was improvising. So I made it through bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees without having formal improvisation training very much. I mean, there was a little bit of it thrown into service playing. How might you decorate a hymn just a little bit, or solo out one of the lines of a hymn. But it wasn't really a formal training in extemporaneous composition, of really thinking about how do you deconstruct what's going on in the music and figure out all the pieces that are there so that you have these tools in your toolbox, and enough so that you can reconstruct something with a fresh face and a fresh sound. So postdoc work I did for my first university sabbatical. I spent time in northern Germany playing the fabulous antique organs in the more remote areas, such as Ostfriesland, which is mostly farmland. The reason being, those were the areas that weren't bombed in World War II, because it was just dairy cows grazing in that area. So those organs were still extant and relatively untouched from early times, from as early as the 15th and 16th centuries. So I practiced for hours through the days and nights of my year and a half there, because I added summers to my sabbatical, and most of the way I got to know those instruments and how those instruments sounded the best was by improvising. And my mentor there, Harald Vogel, was a huge advocate of improvisation. He too had gone through formal training with repertoire. So he was trying to figure out at the same time some sort of system of improvisation. So he would try things out, and I would try things out, and we would go to different organs and try the different ideas out. And I mean, the better the instrument, the easier it is to improvise, because the instrument is such an inspiration. So with a wonderful acoustical setting and these fabulous antique instruments with sounds that imitate the voice, the choral, the human, breathing, flexible winding nature, those instruments also do what the psalms do. They give the gamut of human expression through their voices, and so they just beg to be improvised upon. And so that's where it developed more for me. It's definitely connected to historic instruments as well. And then I was asked to join a team of researchers in Sweden. There's an international project in Göteborg, Sweden, on the west seacoast, spearheaded by Hans Davidsson, who had this question: why do the old instruments sound so much better than the new ones? And he wanted to set about hiring artists and artisans to recreate old instruments and how these instruments were used. And so we had an international team of scientists. They were physicists and acousticians and artisans who had been trained in the historical craft of of forging iron ore and making nails out of that, and roller boards for the organs. And then there were those of us who were musicologists and pedagogues and performers and musicians of various stripes, again from all over the world, and we joined together to center around this question, and we would each do our own research. Mine became then Bach and the Art of Improvisation was my research contribution to this project. And we would each take turns presenting our research, and it was a very healthy academic forum in which each person supported the others. And we, who were musicians and scholars in the musical field, were learning from the physicists as they were testing the mysteries of the wind channels and how the wind actually moves through the pipes of the organs. And it was such a fertile ground for growth and development and questions, and but also in a very collegial support. Camaraderie was a part and parcel of that working experience. It was really the most ideal academic environment with which I've participated.
One of the themes in this book and in conversation is the instrument. And it varies, whether it's an organ or a harpsichord or clavichord or piano, you know. And I'm fascinated with your insights in this because you've played all of them, and you know, you've worked with them.
Yes. One of my dear friends who was also working in Sweden was studying the clavichord, and went to research in Leipzig in various places, historical music instrument museums, how the early clavichords were built. It turns out that was Bach's preferred keyboard instrument because it teaches so much about technique. And so what I did in Sweden is I developed classes of improvisation on the clavichord. So they were learning how the soundist keyboard technique, because the clavichord demands it. It doesn't sound good. It sounds like
have any much
sizzling bacon if you don't use the proper arm weight, if the ergonomics of the bone position really of the arm are not in perfect alignment with the keys that you're playing, the sound will really let you know that the technique is not optimal. And so I thought, rather than try to work with students on teaching them how to have this optimal technique while they have this visual aspect of the music in front of them, erase the visual part so that their aural synapses are all the more open, and they're just improvising. They're learning little patterns with which to improvise, and at the same time perfecting their technique and responding to the instrument with what they're doing. This is the unfortunate thing about training that is only repertoire based, that the people who are wed only to the score in front of them tend to become very visually oriented at the expense of some of the aural perception. And so, I mean, of course there are brilliant repertoire players, there are, millions of them, and people who work very hard for that. But I really find if people have studied improvisation and have taken the time to learn technique on a very specific instrument like the clavichord, their playing will breathe more. It will sound more human. It will have a much broader palette of affect and much more depth in terms of communication and perception of how harmony works and how melody works and how all of this is woven together in the most optimal music making.
Well, it can respond, the player can respond to the music.
That's the key word, John. Responding to the music, responding to the instrument, rather than imposing an idea of this is how this has to be played, or this is how my technique works, I'm going to put that on any instrument. Each instrument has a different character. When you're a keyboardist, a trumpeter can carry his or her own instrument around, so they know their instrument intimately. But when you're a keyboardist, you have to be prepared to respond to each new nuance of each new instrument.
From other reading I do, I know that the first pianos were not like the pianos we have now.
Right.
They were just straight string, they weren't crossed over,
Right. Right.
and that caused a lot of problems.
Yes, there were action issues and for repeated notes, how to get the repetition, and so there were many. I mean, it was an exciting time to be a builder because they were scientists as well. They had to solve a lot of problems and have hypotheses of what might work better, and there are now builders who are making replicas or building in the old style, and again are trying to solve these problems.
One of the sub-things too was the relationship between the harpsichord and clavichord. That you could play what was it? You could play the clavichord, but you wouldn't go back to the harpsichord, or whatever.
Right. A clavicordist can go to the harpsichord and have a lot of success. Someone who's only played the harpsichord can go to the clavichord and feel like they've never played before, because the clavichord is so much more demanding technically.
One of the other things I noticed is the complexity that Bach had in his work that I never fully appreciated. You know, it's all these different elements that were working that he had in his music.
Yes, he had a very sophisticated mind, and one of the reasons his music is so lasting, and I can hear the same work and perform the same work of Bach over and over and not tire of it, which is difficult to say about most composers. There's so much substance to it, but he had a profound sense of beauty with a melodic line, and some of the keenest knowledge about harmony as well. And I've been asked this by colleagues, why Bach? Bach is so difficult, Bach is so complex. But there are a few reasons for that. First of all, when a student will go to a music conservatory or university training, their music theory classes that they begin as freshmen and continue then for multiple years generally start for at least the first 3 semesters with 18th century melody and harmony. It's considered the foundational work for then 19th, 20th, 21st century music. And that study culminates with Bach. Most music students are asked to be able to analyze a chorale of Bach. A chorale is a piece in miniature. It can fit on one page, but the harmony is complex, it's sophisticated, it moves smoothly from one key to another, which is not easy to do if you don't know the secrets of how to do it. I mean, it's a very studied art. And encapsulated in a Bach chorale is everything an improviser really needs to know. So I have taken then Bach chorales, you have a beautiful melody and you have a strong bass line underlying it, so those outer voices are key. And I've taken those as the starting point and really the ending point for developing an improvisation pedagogy method that's based musicologically on historic sources, reports from Bach's pupils about how Bach improvised and how he taught his pupils to improvise. So that addresses today's practice of how students are taught music theory. The other thing is, if one wants to improvise, if it's possible for them to learn how to improvise in an 18th century style, then any pattern language of harmony will be accessible to them. Because Bach's harmony changes on the quarter or even eighth note in his chorales. In 19th century music, the music expanded. You know that the symphonies get longer and longer the later the composer's date is. They're expanded in terms of time, but the harmony isn't as compact. It's stretched out, so the same harmony will be treated for a half a page versus one chord, one quarter note. And the tertial harmony, the harmony that's stacked in thirds at the time of Bach, those thirds were stacked up even more in the 19th century. So Bach used 7th chords, but then they started using 9th, 11th, 13th chords. So it was expanded horizontally, it was expanded vertically, But the basic premise is still there. And if a person can learn how to improvise in miniature, they're going to be much more successful in the symphonic style that's an expansive style. I've adjudicated a lot of improvisation competitions where the competitors try to have a symphonic style, and they succeed in that in volume of sound and in duration of the piece, but not in the structure and the sophistication of the harmony. They would succeed at it, and those that do succeed at it today are those who are steeped in harmony in that compact version, and then they can just stretch it out over time.
But there's all those technical parts that you talk about in this book that you have to have mastery of in order to work that.
Exactly. And if they try to start from a 21st century sort of avant-garde music or even 20th century techniques, if they start there, then it's much more difficult to go back and be able to improvise in the earlier styles than it is to start where this foundation of harmony exists in Bach and go to the future from that.
All the different concepts you have, and they're fascinating. The one I thought was kind of interesting was the interval,
Oh, yeah.
because those kind of things can really destroy you if you don't know how to handle it.
Yes.
It goes on too long, or, so that's not the intent of the composer.
Yes. So do you mean the interval as in terms of pitch, one pitch as in related to the other, or an interval as in time?
Both.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
have to know the space. You have to know the intent. You have to know the practice.
Exactly. So I work with intervals in terms of pitch early on, and then teach in the book how to take a unison note and decorate it. So this note to this note, dee-da-dee-da-dee-dum is one way to decorate it. But they're dee-da-da-dee-dum-dum, ya-da-dee-da-dum. It's going from a C to a C, but there are many different ways to decorate it. So we start in miniature like that, and then gradually build up harmony. Bach's pupils talked about him using the chorales when he first taught. Students needed to learn how to read the soprano line with a thorough bass. Then, after they mastered that technique, he would take away the bass line and have them harmonize a melody. Then he would take away the soprano line and give them the bass line, and they'd have to create the upper parts. And so this is what I do. I follow the path that Bach used in his teaching. And then when those steps are mastered, then that chorale can be transformed into chorale variations, partitas variations that could be on a secular tune just as well as it is a sacred chorale. And then dance suites. So then by that time it's just a matter of changing the rhythm, the meter, and playing with those aspects of it. But the basic principles still come just from that one-page chorale and
Basic
expansions of that.
technique. I interviewed Fred Horowitz on his book on Joseph Albers, and Joseph Albers would stun his students by being able to draw a freehand perfect circle.
Mm.
Now, for art students, that is the devilish thing to do.
Sure.
Because you have to have real training in order to make it a perfect circle. And I think in art there's these different techniques that you have to master without question, or otherwise
Yes.
you're just lost.
Yes, and that's absolutely true for the art of improvisation as well.
Yeah.
It's impossible to go very far without a keen understanding of both melody, harmony, as well as rhythm, meter,